now on Overnights,
I believe in reason and common sense.
Leith Van Onselen from Macro Business with the Treasury of Common Sense.
Common sense never goes out of style.
Hello, Leith. How are you?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Phil. How about yourself?
Good to talk to you. Here we are just waiting for these tariffs to come in, but you're going to explain it to us and break it down so we can actually try and understand it, because a lot of us are going, we don't understand if this is good, bad or indifferent. You were saying off air that it's probably a little bit less bad than we thought it was going to be. Is that right?
Yeah, yes. Certainly in terms of direct impact on Australia, there's very little to worry about. And the reason why there's very little to worry about is that the United States is actually a very small export market for Australia. So that's sort of hard to believe. It's the world's biggest economy.
Right.
Maybe it's second now to China, but, it's right up there. And you think that because of that, it'd be a major export market. It's actually not. So Australia, just to put this into perspective, Australia exports nearly 6 times more to China than we do to the US. So, China's and Asia in general is obviously a much bigger export market than us. And really, the US shouldn't be too concerned about Australia because it actually has a massive trade surplus with Australia. So the US exports more than double what it imports from Australia. So the latest data from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade show that the US exported $88.2 billion worth of goods and services to Australia last year. We exported only $37.5 billion. So it's a decent figure, but in terms of the scale of the economy and our overall exports, it's pretty small. Now, the area where the US tariffs could have an impact is more broadly. So obviously, if Trump goes and slams a whole bunch of tariffs on lots of different countries, there's a risk that they'll retaliate, and they'll retaliate with slapping tariffs back on the US, and then what we'll effectively end up with is a higher tariff world, less trade flows between the world, lower confidence. Stock markets will take a hit, all those sorts of things, and ultimately less economic activity. And that's sort of how it could spill back to Australia. And the biggest impact on Australia will actually be via China. So, as I said, we export 6 times more goods and services to China. China's our biggest export market by far. And if the US slaps a big tariff on China and stops buying as much stuff from China, it means that the Chinese economy will likely slow, and they'll demand less iron ore, less coal, less energy, resources and things from Australia, and that's where the rubber could really hit the road, and it could impact our economy. Also, Australia could find itself getting dumped with more cheap Chinese goods, so goods that China can't sell into the US anymore, they could end up dumping onto Australia. So, you can think of things like electric vehicles, all that sort of stuff. If they're selling less of that stuff into the US, there's a good chance that they'll have surplus and they'll end up selling it to us for a bit less, which is actually, from an inflation perspective, could actually be a little bit deflationary.
Right.
Could actually help to lower imported inflation. But look, I don't think Australia has too much to worry about here, at least directly, because, as I said, we don't export a whole lot to the US, and I don't think the US will go too hard on us anyway. I mean, famous last words is Donald Trump. He's unpredictable. But the fact that they have such a massive trade surplus with Australia, more than double, they export more than double what they import from Australia, and it seems from Donald Trump's from President Trump's rhetoric that he seems to view a trade surplus as good and a trade deficit as bad. And given he's got a massive trade surplus with Australia, I think he'll go a bit easier on us than other countries.
Really? And do you think, in a nutshell, this is a good thing for America?
Look, not really, no. The reason for that, it will drive up the cost of living for Americans. So, if you just think about the sort of things that Americans probably buy, they probably buy a lot of imported Chinese things, whether it's flat screen TVs and white goods and all those sorts of things. And assuming if America slaps a tariff on Chinese goods, that's going to push up the cost of those, which will make it more expensive. There is also obviously the risk of retaliation. So countries that the US sells to could do retaliatory tariffs, which means that the US will export less. There are obviously some pockets of good, so you could end up bringing some manufacturing in some areas back to the US, which would be obviously a positive, but that's also outweighed by the negative the negatives from US consumers, businesses that use imports as part of their factors of production when they make things, all those costs will rise, and it could actually be inflationary from that perspective as well.
All right, let's get back closer to home and talk about Australia's housing supply. What's the solution here?
Yeah, so this is another disappointing bit of data. So your listeners are probably aware that the federal government, signed a housing accord with the states about 18 months ago. Actually, it might be nearly 2 years ago now, which commenced on 1 July last year, and it basically aims to construct 1.2 million homes over 5 years. So that's equivalent to 20,000 homes a month. And on Wednesday, the Australian Bureau of Statistics released some dwelling approvals data, and what that revealed was that only 15,400 homes were approved in February. Now, that's 4,600 or 23% below the target. And over the first 8 months of the housing accord, so we're talking July last year to February this year, only 123,800 homes were approved for construction, and that's 36,200 below the target of 160. So that's 8 months times 20. So that's also 23% below target. So basically, what this tells you is that the government set this target that, to be quite frank, was never likely to be met. And we're not building enough homes, and at the same time, Australia's population continues to grow strongly. So the latest population data we've had, we got from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, said that our population grew by nearly 500,000 in the most recent year. So what it tells you is that we're just not, building enough homes to keep up with this massive population growth and massive immigration. And it's also important to note that just because a home's approved for construction doesn't mean that it'll actually be built. And I looked over the history of the ABS dwelling approvals and construction data, and what it showed is that since the early 1980s, 6% more homes have been approved for construction than have actually been built.
Right.
So they don't know. So just because we've got just over 15,400 homes have been approved for construction in February, based on history, we're not going to get that many built. It might be closer to 14,000. And again, that is so far below the federal government's housing target, it's not funny. And really, the solution here to Australia's housing shortage and crisis is we have to lower demand.
Right.
So it's in line with supply, because at the moment we're running this very high immigration policy, and what it's basically doing is we're importing new housing demand, hundreds of thousands of people a year, faster than we're able to build homes and we're able to build infrastructure for them. And as a result, we've got this rental crisis that we're experiencing at the moment. Now, last week's federal budget, I think it was last week. I'm actually losing track of time. Maybe it was 2 weeks ago.
No, you're right.
It is. So yes, it was last week. I'm sort of losing track now that the election's been called. It's hard to remember what week we're in. But so last week's federal budget forecast that Australia's population is going to grow by 1.8 million people over the next 5 years. Now that and New South Wales alone, and most of this obviously in Sydney, is going to grow by 486,000 in 5 years. Now, just to put that into perspective, that's more than a Canberra.
Yeah.
So slightly more than a Canberra that New South Wales is going to grow in 5 years. And Queensland's going to grow by 412,000 people in 5 years. Now, that's almost a Canberra. Now, obviously, almost all of that's going to be through immigration and overseas migration. And we've got to ask the question, where are the houses going to come from to accommodate all those extra people? Where's the infrastructure going to come from? Where are the schools? Where are the hospitals? Where are the roads, the public transit, the water supplies, all these sorts of things? Obviously, if we're going to grow the population so aggressively as we have really over the last 20 years, there's no way that housing supply can keep up with such strong population growth. And anybody who's lived in Sydney over the last, really since the Sydney Olympics, would know that your quality of life has degraded for most people because you've now got infrastructure bottlenecks everywhere. At the turn of the century, if you drove around Sydney, you only had back then you had about 2 toll roads, the one near the airport and the Sydney Harbour Bridge or Tunnel. Nowadays, you can't drive around Sydney without being, slugged by Transurban.
That's right.
On about a dozen or so toll roads. And it's now the most tolled place in the world. And the reason why Sydney's become one of the most tolled places in the world is because your population has grown by more than 1.5 million. So over this century, and they've had to build this infrastructure for it. And the way they do it is because the state doesn't have enough money to do it, they end up doing these public-private partnerships, and then you end up with all these private companies coming in, building the infrastructure, and then you end up paying for it all. And, you know, the fact of the matter is in the major cities, Brisbane, Sydney, I live in Melbourne, the infrastructure has not kept pace with the massive population growth. The housing has not kept pace. And it's a disaster if we keep going down this road. And if Sydney's permitted to rise to 8.5 million people by 2060, which is the forecast, or Brisbane's, you know, grows to 4.5 to 5 million people by then, obviously you've got to ask, where are the homes going to come to fit all those people? Yeah. Where's the infrastructure going to come from? Where's the water supplies? Where's the energy? All these sorts of things. And unfortunately, you know, we do need a significantly lower and higher skilled migration program than the one that we're running, because otherwise this rental crisis is just going to drag on and on and on.
That's it. Well, let's hope that both parties look at this as one of their initiatives in the upcoming election as well. Always good to talk to you, my friend. Where's a good place to go if you want to find out more information on the internet?
Yeah, so if you're interested in reading about these sorts of topics, go to macrobusiness.com.au, write about all these sorts of issues, economic data, immigration, the housing market, energy market, all those sorts of things.
Download the Demand